This video was digitized from the original DVD in 2023 by Simply Franciscan. It is part of the Zmuda-Moffat Collection of video recordings of lectures given by Franciscan professors and theologians on topics of Franciscan theology, charism, spirituality, and ministry. The lectures span more than 20 years. The Zmuda-Moffat Collection captures some of the seminal lectures shared with the Franciscan family in the rediscovery of the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition, a process which began in the 1970s and continues today. Sister Lisa Zmuda and Sister Kathleen Moffat videotaped these lectures from approximately 2001 through 2022 with permission from the speakers. Separately, they created and distributed study guides to accompany the recordings. Those study guides are available with the videos. Please look for a link in the YouTube post. For further information on the Zmuda-Moffat Collection, please visit our website at simplyfranciscan.org.
What is the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition? Why should we know about it? I'm a historian, so maybe I'll step back. And that is, just about 50 years ago, the Catholic Church was going through a tremendous process of renewal with the Second Vatican Council. And for those in religious communities, the Council gave a challenge, a twofold challenge. One was to rediscover their own roots. What is their charism? What do they offer in a distinctive way to the people of God and to the world? But the other was, in some ways, in a certain tension with it, because it wasn't simply saying going back and discover your original inspiration, but how do you speak to today? How do you engage a vastly changed world? And we Franciscans come from a tradition now that is 800 years old. Francis and Clare and the other figures of our tradition lived in a world that's vastly different from ours. And yet at the same time, the Council challenged us as Franciscans to go back to our sources, to drink again at the source. And in so doing, we discovered that these medieval sources, the lives of these medieval people, still can speak very directly and personally to people today. And the task of our Franciscan Intellectual Tradition and the different people who are writing about it, who are speaking about it, who are enthused about it, is to put people today into touch with these same treasures that we have come to know and experience. The Franciscan Intellectual Tradition is not primarily about ideas. It is about a life. People who have come to see reality a certain way and have oriented their life in terms of that reality, but have also struggled to verbalize that in words, to express it in art, various ways in which we can be put into a certain experience of God and the world. And this is the task of our tradition, and the speakers that will follow me will give you a little taste of some of the major figures in that tradition and how they might speak to us today.
When we speak about the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition, the best starting point, really, is the experience of Francis and Clare. They're the beginnings of our tradition, not necessarily their writings. I think those come a little bit later. What we should focus on is an experience that they had of God, of the world, of neighbor, of each other, that really stands at the root of this intellectual tradition. A few of the writings that we have from them will tell us about their personal experience, but a lot of their writings really talk to us about a vision outward toward other people. It's not so much inner-directed as it is outer-directed. And once that's put into writing, those texts whether the letters of Clare to Agnes, Francis's letters to the friars, or the Rule, then become the foundational documents for a tradition that reflects things that are important to them. What are some of these things? In the case of Francis, I would say the importance of the poor, the importance of the created world, the beauty of the created world, seeing that as a family of brothers and sisters, the importance of a communal experience of God and the gospel, the importance of the incarnation, his great devotion to the infancy of Christ, the humanity of Christ as a special emphasis, and the way that that connects with issues like the Eucharist and the importance of the material world. Francis's love for the cross, his very affective identification with the experience of Jesus in the gospel. All of this helps to shape the later tradition. It doesn't repeat what he says, and sometimes actually disagrees with him, but it's at the basis of what other people are going to write about and talk about and experience. Similarly with Clare, she has her own experience expressed uniquely in the form of life and in her letters. It's similar in many ways to things that we find in Francis. She's clearly inspired by things that Francis does and says, but it's also clear that she has her own call. She refers to the importance of the vocation or the calling she has received as the greatest gift that she has. The way that she encourages, for example, Agnes up in Prague in the present-day Czech Republic, reflects interests and concerns that are different from those of Francis. The importance of beauty, the way that she uses imagery that would be very appropriate to a woman of the nobility, which you won't find in the writings of Francis. And I think for Clare, and this is a little odd when we think about it, her emphasis on poverty as a kind of a key to the experience of Christ and therefore the experience of who God is, takes a very different direction that puts our tradition, I think, into a reflection on Christology that's really rooted in God's poverty. I think for Clare also the importance of the community, the importance of the sisters, really shapes and forms her spirituality in a way that is unique to her. As with Clare, so with Francis, we can't touch her experience directly. We touch it through the medium of texts that she wrote and which others wrote about her. During her lifetime, the testimony of sisters after her death in the process of canonization, and the lives and legends written later at the time of her canonization. But with both of these figures, Francis and Clare, though different, they do have certain common emphases that will kind of spin off in later generations to find voices of agreement, voices also sometimes of dissent, but certainly voices that change, that modify, that personalize what they find in that kind of rooting original experience and give us the rich diversity of the later Franciscan intellectual tradition.
Hi, I'd like to speak just a bit today, if I could, on the question of St. Bonaventure and CFIT and why, in my opinion and the opinion of many others, Bonaventure is a crucial figure for study, not simply for scholars, but for Franciscans and many people who would not perhaps identify themselves as Franciscans, but are very interested in a number of themes that Bonaventure himself deals with. Bonaventure looms large. He looms large over the Franciscan tradition and over the church tradition, and one of the reasons why is his work spans not simply academic work, but also pastoral work. He was an administrator as well as a preacher. He was a teacher who walked miles and miles and miles across Europe to meet with friars, to preach to different groups, and we know that he had an incredible impact for several reasons, but one is simply if you look at manuscripts and if you go into libraries, you can see that what he said was written down by others, treasured by them, and passed on to him. For example, just his sermons alone. Over 200 some sermons have been preserved of Bonaventure, which tell us that there was a group that was quite interested in those sermons. We have a number of different texts too, and what we do notice when we look at the transmission of texts is that the texts were being distributed not simply to other friars, but to women religious groups, to lay groups. There was something about Bonaventure that at the time, but also down through the centuries, has echoed with people who are interested in spirituality and theology. I think one of the key insights that I would hope to bring to this brief presentation is that Bonaventure speaks to people who are passionate, emotional, but also rational and reasonable. And what I mean by that is he gives full range to the possibility of using the mind. He speaks about how the mind has to be evangelized. So I don't have to leave my intellect at the door as a Christian. I can evangelize the mind. I can go deeply in Scripture. I can go deeply in theology. I can go deeply into other liberal arts and feel quite comfortable that that is a mainline Christian approach to living in the world. But at the same time, the contact with truth is always, in this case, or at least often for many of us, a contact with beauty as well. And beauty raises the affections. It raises desire. And Bonaventure, in many ways, is a theologian of desire. If you look at his sermon on nativity, he's celebrating the coming of Christ. And what he says is, Christ doesn't come simply because we have sinned. No. Humanity, which has fallen, longs for that which it loves. And it will not be satisfied until that which its object of its love is present. In other words, we long for God, and we long for God not simply in spirit, but in the flesh. And he says this is why the incarnation takes place. The incarnation takes place because our desires are fulfilled in the coming of Jesus in the flesh. This kind of dynamic, I think, is attractive to people because it does allow us to start from the human. What are my desires? What are my loves? What are my longings? What do I look for? What does my family desire? What does the human race wish for? All these desires are not simply random, but they're indicative of a deeper longing for God, which Bonaventure, in his theology, by reflecting on these desires, brings us to the point where we can see that our desires in one way or another, through the grace of God, will lead us back in that great journey, not simply of the mind, but of the human person, back to God. And he's clear, not by ourselves, but together with others. That kind of keying in on the human experience is fundamental, I think, for many of us. I teach undergraduate students, and they resonate very well with this idea of longing. What are we looking for? And is, in fact, the Christian response, and in particular the Franciscan response, the best response? Bonaventure would be one of those who would say very clearly, yes. He preaches that, he teaches that, and we see when he's Minister General that he's also very concerned in helping his individual brothers learn this as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, he traveled quite frequently. We have very few stories of Bonaventure, but the two stories that have come down through the tradition have to do with him walking, visiting brothers. There's the one story where he's in the Hermitage, and they bring the cardinal's hat, and he says, put the hat in the corner or put it on the hook, I'll get it later. The other one is told that he was outside the friary in Florence, and he was leaving a meeting, and there was a brother who was really waiting to talk to him on the side of the road. The brother came up and said, Brother Bonaventure, can I speak with you? And the other friars sort of dismissed this guy. Bonaventure stopped on the middle of the road and began to talk to his brother and said to his companions, this is what we do. This is who we are. So I would want to encourage those who are coming to CFIT, looking at the website, looking at the literature, talking to different individuals, to focus not simply on Bonaventure, but Bonaventure is clearly a gateway into so many of the themes that were important for Franciscans in the past and have a perennial interest today. His view, for example, on creation, the idea that creation is a song that God sings already tells you something about the image of God for Franciscans. When you get into his writings, clearly there are difficult parts, and we all need to work with each other to help to understand and interpret them. But there are some things that just are gems. One example is just his idea of animals. He talks about the position of animals before the fall and what happens to animals after the fall, how in the beginning they were our companions as well, and after the fall we've turned them into our servants. But he says the affection that we have for animals, that desire to have, let's say, a pet nearby, and he specifically mentions birds and cats. He's a cat lover. Some will like that, some won't. But what it tells us is this. He says the affection that we have for animals is an echo of what it was like in the beginning, when we were all together in a community that was not man and beast, but it was the created community. Now, maybe it's a pipe dream. Maybe it's beyond our possibilities to recapture that. We have to move forward. But I think as we move forward and try to understand what we want to do as Franciscans, the world that we want to construct, and we are faced with a challenge, the world will construct us completely and totally if we don't have a response. And our response allows us to construct ourselves in this new world together with our brothers, our sisters, who are not simply human beings, but every creature, animate or inanimate.
With someone like Duns Scotus, we have a complete reframing of the philosophical vision of the Franciscan tradition at the turn of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. What Scotus tries to do is reframe the Franciscan vision around the rationality of love, around divine freedom and generosity, and around human dignity. Many of these concepts are well known, but probably the most well known of all three is his position on human dignity and personal identity that we identify with the famous and perhaps infamous Latin term haeccetas, everybody's favorite. More commonly known is Scotus's contribution to the theological vision of the Franciscan tradition, and that is in his articulation of the reason for the incarnation, which was not identified as belonging to human sinfulness, but rather was God's initiative from all eternity to become human even prior to creation. And of course, his very famous defense of the Immaculate Conception. So Scotus offers us a remarkable Franciscan thinker, a philosopher, a theologian, a major voice who will influence the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th century of philosophy and theology in the Catholic tradition.
In a certain sense, one of the founders of the intellectual Franciscan tradition is Alexander of Hales, today not very well known. He was born around 1180 in Hales, in England, but he studied and he taught in Paris. And when the first Franciscans around 1219-20 came to Paris and frequented the university, Alexander of Hales was becoming one of the first professors and masters of the Franciscan. Also, in the beginning, he wasn't a Franciscan. He was important for his time because he introduced a new method of theological interpretation based on a biblical and philosophic mythology. And he is giving a synthesis between metaphysics and a theology of salvation. So he don't want to speak theoretically on God. He wants to see immediately the relationship between God and human beings and between God and the creation. That brings him to a changement of his ontological vision. He stops ongoing with a static, fixed ontological vision, coming more to a dynamic vision of life and a dynamic vision of being, and a dynamic vision of human being becoming image of God. And this dynamic vision he was introducing in his theological interpretation comes from his combination between a theology of Trinity, the unity of plurality, and a Christology of incarnation. And he interprets and sees the incarnation as the main point of creation. Creation is seen in the light of incarnation. The lifestyle of human beings is seen also in the light of the incarnation, God who really becomes flesh in the reality of this world. And this vision, this importance of a Christology of incarnation brings the birth to the concepts of gratuity and goodness, one of the most important concepts in the Franciscan tradition, gratuity and goodness.
When we hear the term Franciscan intellectual tradition, we can often think that it's limited to the friars who were professional scholars, who were trained at the universities and at the studia. But if we limit ourselves to that understanding of the intellectual tradition, we forget how diverse and how comprehensive the Franciscan intellectual tradition is. In fact, the tradition included both the friars and the clerics, but also lay people, both men and women, who learned their Franciscan theology from hearing the friars preach, from being in spiritual direction with the friars and with one another. And I think they even learned the theological tradition from each other through their lived experiences. Here I'm thinking of people like Lady Jacoba, who was present with Francis as he lay dying, presence with a man suffering in his final days. I'm also thinking of someone like Elizabeth of Hungary, who had great compassion for the poor and lived out of an abundance of love for her family. She deeply loved her husband and her children. In that regard, expresses an appreciation for the incarnation, which is a fundamental aspect of the Franciscan tradition. And then I'm also thinking of someone like Rose of Viterbo, who from the age of, let's say, about 7, started to imitate the friars by taking up their evangelical life and preaching in the streets of Viterbo. So these lay people, I think, embodied the Franciscan intellectual tradition. And so in that regard, I use the term somatic theologians. They embody the teachings and they teach others through how they live out the Franciscan tradition. Now, we might overlook these people today, but in fact, many of these lay people, again, both men and women, were famous to their contemporaries. Here I'm thinking of someone like Margaret of Cortona, who was considered the third light of the Franciscan tradition, right up there with Francis and Clare. And there's someone like Angela of Foligno, who is called Magistra Theologorum, Master of Theologians. So here is a woman who deeply embodied the Franciscan understanding of the incarnation and the appreciation of understanding and apprehending the suffering Christ. She did this by her devotional practices, so that she lived out this theological understanding in such a way that her contemporaries called her a magistra. So I think these people are so important for us to look at today, to study today, for multiple reasons. First of all, they show us that the Franciscan intellectual tradition isn't limited to just the friars or just the vowed women, but to all people who follow Francis and Clare in walking in a life of poverty and love of Christ. In addition, they tell us that we are all responsible for carrying on the tradition, for embodying the tradition and teaching one another, not just through writings and sophisticated theological discourses, but in how we interact with one another. So I encourage us to consider both the lay men and the lay women of the Franciscan tradition as specifically part of that intellectual tradition.
The Franciscan tradition is so vast and broad that even scholars have trouble keeping track of all the voices. Darlene Prides talks about those voices that come from somatic theologians. And so we're used to hearing from Francis and Clare, but there's many other voices in that vernacular tradition as well. By the same token, there's a vast array of voices who are trained academically. We could think of at least a few who are representative of what we might call the Oxford tradition, who are also very important at Paris. John Peckham, who was an important 13th century theologian and eventually Archbishop of Canterbury, made important contributions to science and philosophy. Roger Bacon is another 13th century Parisian and Oxford voice who makes important contributions to the church's understanding of pedagogy, to the friars' understanding of their own life, and also various philosophical contributions. William of Ockham is perhaps the titan from Oxford, whose critical philosophy spawned a different and alternative vision of Franciscan philosophy. His enormous amount of political works make an important contribution in that field. By the same token, there's various theologians who are important to the Paris tradition. Matthew of Aquisparta and Peter Olivi take up the theology of Bonaventure in varying ways. Matthew of Aquisparta was also an important cleric who is infamous for kicking Dante out of Florence. Peter Olivi thought intensely about Franciscan life and Franciscan economics, and perhaps delivers one of the most crushing critiques of Anselm's Cur Deus Homo in the Middle Ages. Beyond that, into the 14th century, two other voices are also very critical. Petrus Tomei is an important Spanish Franciscan thinker who codified the views of Duns Scotus. In his Quadlibital Questions, he offers a kind of primer of Scotistic theology and even has a fascinating quadlibital question on Francis's Stigmata. Another very important voice whom we sometimes forget is Peter Auriol. Peter Auriol wrote on virtually every subject we could think of. He took up and critiqued many positions of Scotus and even argued positions of Scotus in new ways. He drove the theological discussion at Paris for nearly 40 to 50 years and was eventually posthumously condemned in the 15th century for his views on divine foreknowledge. So the Franciscan tradition includes many, many voices that we've yet to explore, and hopefully we can begin to treat some of those thinkers in the near future.
You've heard now some of the figures who express this tradition, people that speak to us. But the other challenge we are facing is how to unpack their message, how to put people like you in touch with them, in touch with their lives, in touch with their thought. And so what we struggle to do as Franciscans today is devise the means by which these Franciscan men and women can speak to you. And we hope to be able to do that in various ways.